The film begins with a career woman in her 40s named Grace. She is still single and has never been married. She lives alone, but she has a good friend named Sherry who is considered her own sister. That afternoon, Grace met Sherry and said that she was not feeling well, maybe because she worked too much. Sherry then suggested going to the clinic, because at their age maintaining health is important. The next day, Grace came to a health program in her area. When she arrived there, she was greeted by a woman named Natasha. She is an assistant and daughter of the doctor there and the owner of the clinic. Not long after, a doctor came to the clinic named Paul. Grace was examined in the room, and Paul said that she had to come there regularly so that the program she was running would be completely successful. However, it seems that Paul is starting to be interested in Grace. Even when Paul contacted Grace that night, not to discuss his program, but Paul approached Grace. Since then, Grace has come to Paul more often, and they have also become closer and often eat together. Not only that, Paul was also often invited to his house to make out. Not only once but almost every day. Until one day, when Grace, Sherry and Paul attended a party, Paul saw Grace being approached by a man. Of course Paul did not accept it. An argument ensued between them. But it was only for a moment. Paul said he loved Grace very much, until finally they made up and continued to make out many times. But since then, Paul seemed to control Grace's life. Whatever she did would be wrong in Paul's eyes. Even when Sherry wanted to ask Grace out, Paul forbade her and said Grace was still busy and could not be disturbed. Their relationship grew closer day by day. Paul convinced Grace that he would marry her. Even Grace was given an important position in a company owned by Paul. Not only that, Grace was also invited to move and live with him in a private villa located in the forest. In that place, Grace accidentally found suspicious files. The document revealed that Paul had been accused of being a doctor who was not right. There was even a file stating that Paul had forced someone to make out. Paul tried to defend himself. He said it had happened a long time ago and had been handled by the authorities. However, Grace found a file that had not happened long ago. Garrett continued to pressure Paul, until Paul was finally cornered and punched Grace. A few days later, Grace met Sherry. She told her about the incident. Sherry told Grace to be careful with Paul, but Grace said that maybe Paul was just confused and she still understood it. When Grace came home, Paul immediately met her and apologized for what he had done yesterday. And in the end they reconciled. A few days later, Paul threw a party and invited friends and co-workers. At that time, unexpectedly, Paul proposed to Grace. Although Grace did not fully trust Paul, she accepted the proposal. However, the longer she was with Paul, Grace began to see Paul's true nature. Paul often acted rudely towards her. Until finally she went to a community with the same fate as her to pour out her heart. She also made a plan to leave Paul's house. But not long after, Paul apologized to Grace again. Grace trusted Paul again, and they got along again, and of course they often made out there. Paul also made juice, which he said was vitamins from fruits and vegetables. But after drinking it regularly, Grace always felt dizzy and her body was getting weaker. Grace began to suspect Paul, until one day her suspicions were proven. At that time Sherry came there to meet Grace. But Paul said that Grace was away and didn't know where. Hearing that, Grace was even more convinced that Paul was not a good person. Grace managed to get away from there on foot, but accidentally she ran into Paul and immediately invited him back home. When Paul returned to make the same juice, Grace secretly threw it away. Since then Grace has felt better. And one night, Paul forced Grace to make out. But fortunately Grace managed to get away from there. Until finally she found a house and asked the owner to call the police. In the end the police came, but did not find Paul there. Grace managed to get away from Paul, but she and the authorities were still looking for Paul. On the other hand, Paul apparently returned to looking for Grace's replacement. He met a woman named Neva. Neva was also given an important position just like Grace. From there, Grace and the authorities began to find a bright spot about Paul's whereabouts. On the other hand, Paul is now in a relationship with Neva. Paul was invited to live with her in her house. But one day, Neva found a newspaper that said that Paul was a fugitive. The debate took place there. Neva's father asked Paul to leave there, but Paul, who was angry and upset, instead greeted Neva and her father and also himself. He was afraid that his career would be ruined and he would have to go to jail. In the end, Grace could breathe a sigh of relief after hearing the news about Paul. She told all her stories to her community friends. Grace also asked everyone to be careful, so that what she experienced would not happen again. Until finally the film was over.